Iosif, what do you think about original sin as a concept?
As a concept, the question of whether we are born evil or good, I think it's translated most often as is the cause of evil nature or nurture? And in that, I think there's an element of both. So I think that there's a diathesis stress model where we all have a certain predisposition towards an action, either an evil action or a good action or a neutral action. And depending on our life circumstance and depending on the environment and depending on the decisions that we make, which generate our environment, which choose how we go through life, that will either make those decisions manifest or not. So for example, if there are two people, one is heavily predisposed to alcoholism and the other one has no predisposition to alcoholism, they can both wind up being alcoholics, but it takes a lot less bad decisions for someone with a strong predisposition towards alcoholism to become an alcoholic versus somebody with no predisposition to become an alcoholic. Another way to think about it would be something like depression. For, again, two people, one who has a strong predisposition, a very light shock might put them into depression, whereas another person might be more resilient, have less predisposition, and they could withstand a much larger shock without falling into a depression. Now, this is all looking at it from a very simple nature, nurture, diathesis stress model. But there's a different level at which we could analyze it, and that is, how do your decisions shape your environment? So I don't think we are a product of our environment. It's not that it's not passive, it's active. So a person's choices push them to different environments, and those environments will shape them. But because you're shaping the environment that you are winding up in, it is a collaboration, your personality or your soul and reality.
What steps do you take as an individual to cultivate the environment that you inhabit?
I seek out people who are interesting to me, who I think make me better. And then I seek out to have honest conversations with them, as well as reflecting honestly on my own failures and weaknesses. And I try to work on removing them or minimizing them, or in some way making sure that they do not impact who I am becoming.
How do you judge your pace of progress whenever you are working on something that you have reflected upon and identified as a weakness?
Usually I try to find a quantifiable metric, something that I can track pretty easily because it becomes a number. So there's the idea that whatever gets measured gets managed. So one of virtue that I truly believe in is punctuality. So I would count how many meetings I would be late to per year. And when that number got below 5, given that I maybe average 4 meetings a week, below 5 means less than a 2% failure rate. That's so finding a quantifiable metric, not fooling yourself into thinking that you're better than you are.
Which do you think is a more toxic trait to society, fear or laziness? And why?
I think both fear and laziness can be assets. So laziness can provoke you to, you've done some coding. You know how to write software. I've spoken to a lot of coders, and one of the things that they really hate to do is repetitive tasks. So they are too lazy to do the task repetitively, and they'll spend way more time writing a script that will do it for them. So is that laziness? In a way, because they don't want to do something, that's laziness, but it provokes them to do something that is more value add. So I consider myself very lazy. And I'm willing to work very, very hard not to do things. So I don't think that it's weakness. I think it can. I don't think that it's toxic to a society. I think it can be an asset. Although clearly, if people aren't provoked by their laziness into action of another way, of another sort, then it does decrease the productivity of a society. In terms of fear can also be an asset. Fear can push you to create a defensive strategy. Fear can, there's the idea only the paranoid survive. If you're not fearful, you're not going to think of all the risk factors, and therefore you can't mitigate for those risk factors. Risk is absolutely central to what I do. Risk is the focus of most of my attention. So fear, huge asset. Now, if the fear prevents action, prevents positive action, prevents the generation of value, then it becomes toxic. Just like most things, most character traits or most descriptors of a society, they're very rarely just unidirectionally toxic.
When was the last time that fear prevented you from taking action on doing something, and what was the way you reflected to identify that?
The last time I chose not to pursue something due to fear was really early stage project idea I was working on with some friends on an AI generated codec that would be specific to the video clip being encoded. And we came up with what I thought was a really, really good idea. We all liked it. We started doing some testing on the minimal viable product. And then when we looked into the patent portfolio, there's a very well-funded startup with all the biggest names in the world already attached, in that space. So the fear of that competition completely closed that project. Now, could we have pursued it and created something? Yes. And could it have been better than what the best in the world have produced? Theoretically, yes, but practically, no. So we abandoned that project. And that was clearly due to the fear of competition.
What's the difference between your relationship with competition when you're acting on behalf of a company or a group that you're involved in, and your relationship with competition as an individual?
When you are a company, you have to look at the competitive landscape and make a calculated decision in terms of what to pursue, what not to pursue. Otherwise, you're not maximizing shareholder value. So you have a legal and ethical responsibility to be highly cognizant of the competition. On a personal level, I appreciate competition. I think it can be a tool to accelerate personal growth, and to give a feedback of a hierarchical ranking of where you're at within a given parameterized and fixed system, such as weightlifting. But I'm more interested in things that are not competitive. So I'm not interested in competition for competition's sake. And if I have the choice between doing something that's within the bounds of competition, I would rather be doing something new. I have more interest in coming up with an idea and materializing it rather than competing within an already ossified structure. Because in order for it to be competitive, it has to have a level of completeness that allows other people to be, in some ways, imitating the original concept.
When you're doing something completely new and you don't have a basis for comparison because the thing is so novel, how do you judge the quality of what you're doing and whether it's right and how it has value?
I think ultimately you yourself know what's quality and what's not, what's value and what's not value. It obviously depends what the idea pertains to. So if it's a business idea, you can define value in terms of the percentage of value you can capture, which you can quantify in terms of money. So that's a great proxy. That's a great feedback system from your society or from reality, depending on how broadly you decide to think about that concept, about the value of your work if it's in the realm of business. If it's in the realm of something that's less quantifiable, for example, literature, and you're a writer, you can consider that a competitive endeavor, and you can judge yourself based on the amount of accolades or critic reviews or prizes that you get. But that's not really quality. That could be a proxy for quality, but increasingly it's a bad proxy for quality. So when you're writing, you have to be the ultimate judge of the quality that you're creating artistically. And depending on the refinement of your taste, depending on how good of a judge you yourself are, and how harsh of a critic you are to your own work, it's not something that you can really quantify. It is something that you can reflect on it, and that you can have an honest interaction with. Kurt Vonnegut gave grades to each one of his books, and he's pretty harsh with his books. So I think he gave a bunch of C's, a few B's.
In what ways is that artist's feeling, the feeling of being the person who's making the thing, and having an innate sense of knowing whether the thing is of quality or not, in what ways does that relate to faith, and how is it similar?
The idea of quality is in a way ephemeral. So you can quantify many aspects of a product, but quality is not something that you can pinpoint. You can pinpoint any single parameter, but quality is something that is bigger than a single parameter. Otherwise, we would have long ago parameterized it. So we can do that with metal. We can say, okay, this metal is of this grade, it's this purity, and so purity is our proxy for quality of that metal. That's fine, and that's a commodity, and therefore it's already defined. I think you're asking about quality of something that is a whole, not of a commodity, but of a product as a whole. Maybe a car or a book. Mm-hmm. Something that has too many parameters such that quality can't be optimized or identified.
Yeah, like in a piece of good literature.
Yes. So quality is something that that you would appreciate as a whole. And anything that you can appreciate as a whole is more than the sum of its parts. So quality is an element of the whole, is a characteristic of the whole, and is not a characteristic of the parts. When you have something that is a characteristic of the whole, you are making a judgment on being, on something, not on a part. It's non-reductionist. So when you're talking about making a judgment on the whole, it ties into faith, because there's quality as an idea of the good. So if you have an idea of the good, where does the good come from, or what is the definition of good? You could define it in any arbitrary way, but not any arbitrary way is equally valid. So what I mean by that is that you have faith that you know what is good, and that definition of good is what's going to determine how you feel about quality, how you appreciate quality, or how you do not have an ability to appreciate quality. When you mentioned literature, Karlov Knausgaard gave a pretty wonderful explication of the different ways of relating to poets that you have access to versus poets that you don't have access to. And he said, well, when you read a great poet, and I'm paraphrasing here, but when you read a great poet, you either get it, or you don't get it. And if you get it, that's it. You have access. You're there. You're with the poet. But if you don't get it, you can either accept the tragedy of not having access to a walled garden, and you never will. You can protest and try to learn and study and try to find a way into that walled garden and try to find a hole. Or you can reject its very existence. And that you can say, well, every garden's the same. There's nothing that makes this poet better than that poet. You can reject the whole idea of quality, or the whole idea of the good, or the whole idea of a hierarchy of aesthetics. And that is the most tragic response.
In what ways do the ideas you're talking about right now relate to the state of society in our current age?
I think our society is going through a massive struggle. It's reconciling its modern history with its postmodern interlude. So our current society in America, circa 2023, has a hangover from a mix of nihilism and postmodernism, where everybody recognizes the multiplicity of narrative, the potential for other values, the fragmentation and atomization of human experience writ large. And that is deeply distressing, because it, in many ways, it takes away the emotional pull of having a story, of having a common story, which is a form of having a common faith. It's something that brings us together. So in a modernist philosophy, we would be living or working towards the American dream. We would have faith that America is a force for good, and we'd have a common vision of going to the moon, of becoming an interplanetary species. Something of a grand narrative that has a positive direction. And then there was this infection of postmodern philosophy that tried to break all of that apart, that tried to take the hierarchical structure of the good and the base and make everything equal, and also fragment the narrative such that there was no grand story that we could all be a part of, that everybody's living in their own story. And largely because everything's as good as anything else, it's all directionless. And that absurdity leads to irony and cynicism. So not taking anything seriously. And where we are now, I think, is a reconciliation between the modernist and the postmodernist. And I think certain cultural products like Rick and Morty are bringing back a core of sentimentality into a hopeless place. And that's the beginning of a revitalization. That's the beginning of getting back to a real core that can build a common narrative again. Recognizing the choice of the environment that you're creating, recognizing the choice of community that you believe in, recognizing the choice of a vision that you want to be a part of, but choosing a common vision.
I once heard you describe the difference in how you lived your life from one of subscribing to hedonistic philosophy, and then I believe you described yourself as transitioning to a Stoic philosophy. Talk about what prompted you to make that transition and the difference between what your life looked like living as a hedonist and living as a Stoic.
Yeah. So I was also subject to the environment of postmodernism and the nihilism, and the reaction to that seemed logical as hedonism. So up until about 20 years old, I would very much enjoy the physical pleasures to the best of my ability and take them to to try to suck the marrow out of life, really take it to its max. And then I was at Trinity College at the University of Melbourne doing a study abroad, and I ran out of money. Very simply, I spent my savings partying, and I had about 4 months left in my study abroad out of 6, and I had just enough to get by and get back home. So I couldn't really continue my lifestyle. And coincidentally with that time, the social group that I had formed in those 2 months, for one reason or another, fell apart. So I was pretty much alone in a foreign country that was thousands of miles from home. Internet was limited. It was metered back then, and it was pretty hard to work with. And school, like the university that I was at, it wasn't very engaging. I didn't have to spend too much time there. I was living alone in a dorm room there, so I didn't have much to do, and I didn't have much resources to do it. And I dedicated myself to making the most of that time. So I had about 4 months of being mostly alone, of having mostly no resources, and having very little to do. So I read up on the Stoics, and focused in, started working out every day, was extremely disciplined, dialed in my diet. I read something like 39 books in those 4 months. I watched hundreds of movies, crazy amount of essays, and I had a focus on making sure that I wasn't wasting any time, that every day I was getting better, and I was getting better according to certain virtues that I believed in. Strength, erudition, etc. And as I was also reading Stoicism, there was an ideal that I found very appealing, which is of a Stoic monk, a monk who is approached and told all the compliments in the world. And he nods his head. And then the next day he's going around and shouted at all the insults in the world. And he nods his head without any reaction. The point was being completely impervious to the outside world because you know that you are doing the right thing, or you are pursuing what is most good. The side effect of that philosophy, which was very effective in being disciplined and moving forward and creating progress in any particular aspect of life, was that it left me very cold. I'm naturally a very warm person. I grew up that way, very fortunate to have wonderful relationships with my parents, with my family, very loving. But when I got into Stoicism, I became very rigid and hard because I thought that was the best ideal way to be impervious to the outside world. And I couldn't cry for a very long time at all. It became a way of being that held me for a long time.
Where did you go from there?
From there, I went to existentialism. So, after a long enough time in Stoicism and recognizing that it wasn't the most powerful thing, that it was a very useful operating system for living, and already rejecting hedonism because of its lack of meaning, I switched over and rejected Stoicism, not all of Stoicism, just the Stoic ideal, in favor of existentialism, which is the idea that existence precludes purpose, and such that if you exist, you can choose your purpose, you can generate a purpose. I took that to heart and was, instead of purely seeking to optimize virtues, I went and decided to be someone who is creating meaning. And that includes emotional attachments and emotional interactions.
What would you say to someone who's working now to define their purpose?
Try as much as they can. See what excites them, see what resonates, and reflect. A balance of action and reflection, where not too much reflection such that to come to a purpose just by thinking, and not so much action such as it becomes frantic and not thoughtful. I think that if someone is seeking their purpose, either they have achieved a very big goal or they're looking for a goal to achieve. And finding a purpose in either of those scenarios involves mostly action, reflection, on a total base of honesty. The reason why the honesty is so important is because a lot of actions, a lot of choices of purposes can be imitative, can be fake. And so being relentlessly honest, at least with yourself, but preferably with a trusted friend who you can speak to as you would yourself, something that Seneca mentioned in his letters, is going to help exponentially as you figure out what really inspires you, what doesn't inspire you, what makes you feel good, what connects with you and what doesn't. I have a friend who worked in finance for some time after university, and it didn't mean anything to him. He did not like his job. It didn't connect to anything for him. And what he loved doing was going to the gym. He loved going to the gym. And he didn't just like going to the gym. He also enjoyed talking to people and helping people. And he left his job in finance and came by to my kitchen, and we sat down and we talked about what potentially could work, what would make him happy. And came to the idea of physical therapy. And it hit the nail on the head. Just hit the nail on the head. It took him a very long time to get there because he had to start from scratch. He already had a degree. He already had a short career. And he had to go back to school, build up new connections, do everything. And he was able to do it from start to finish. From nothing to a doctorate of physical therapy. Now he works as a physical therapist. His job is meaningful to him. He connects with his patients. He found his purpose. None of that time is wasted. If he had stayed in finance, all of that time would have been wasted. But he didn't do it just by reflection. There was a lot of action. And I think that what I would tell somebody who's looking for their purpose is try things, think about them deeply, understand your own motivations, and see what connects, then build on that.
What are your motivations for making going to the gym part of your daily routine?
Well, aesthetics, health, willpower.
Say more about willpower. What does having an exercise regimen teach you about willpower?
I don't think it teaches you about willpower. I think it exercises your willpower. I think that you are born with a certain amount of willpower, just like you are born with a certain amount of muscle tissue. And then you have to do things that are hard repeatedly. Force yourself to do things that you don't want to do in order for you to expand the amount of willpower that you can exert. Same thing with the muscle. You have to force it to grow. You have to make it lift more than it could have in order for it to grow. And I don't think that it's just an analogy that, oh, building willpower is like going to the gym. No, I think going to the gym builds willpower. I think willpower is part physical, part mental. It's really a spiritual process. Forcing yourself to do something and growing through effort. That is the exercise of willpower. And every time, as you make decisions, the one who is making the decision, is changed by the decisions you make. So when you diminish your willpower and you make yourself weaker, that makes the next decision point have a preponderance towards getting even weaker. So you could get into a vicious cycle where you give up slowly. You lose your ability to reach towards the good because it's so easy to degrade yourself into the bad. On the other hand, if you force yourself into the good, it makes it a little bit easier to choose to make yourself stronger and to get into a virtuous cycle. The path of life, to stay on the right path, is quite narrow. There's so many temptations, so many ways to ruin your life. There are not that many ways to make your life better. Not that many. To choose those decisions that make your life better versus all of those that make your life worse, that takes willpower. So the more you have it, the better.
What is something like a daily fitness routine that would be an exercise of willpower to someone, that isn't just physical, but that might be mental or something else entirely?
Any effortful daily habit. So whether that's writing every day, morning pages are a popular way to do it. Meditation, especially if you don't like to do it. 10, 20 minutes of meditation a day. If you don't like it, especially. Very good. Making your bed if you don't like it. A lot of willpower is about doing things that you don't want to do, forcing yourself to do things. The superiority of mind over matter. It can be an intellectual thing. It can be a physical thing. Whatever it is, once you choose that you want to do this, or you make a commitment to yourself, follow that commitment.
What has exercising your willpower taught you about how to effectively operate a business? Or where in your business I might ask you to exert the most agency? Because a lot of running a business can be getting into the day of things and, doing your accounting, or going to meetings with customers or customer service, or walking things forward. How do you, as someone who has gotten multiple businesses off the ground, most focusedly exert your agency in order to move into the novel space that you talk about before, in terms of not competing against other people or doing these types of things? How do you flex that muscle in the space of business and not just the gym?
Focusing in on what matters. Mostly it's about prioritization. What's the critical path, and focusing in on that and being disciplined enough to never stray from the critical path. Spending your time and attention working on what matters, not on what looks good, not what on is standard, but on what really, really matters. Understand clarity. Clarity is everything. And clarity is perfect with the gym too. Because at the gym, it's all about the number. How much weight are you pushing in a given exercise with good form or in a given tempo? You're clear. You can't lie to the iron. You can't work your way around it. Either you can do it or you can't do it. And if you can't do it, then either you're not trying hard enough, or you're not recovered, or there's something in your training system that's wrong. Then you do cause-effect chain analysis and you figure out, what do I need to do to get this done? Business, same thing, focusing on what you need to get done, what's the next step, being clear about that. And then at any given major decision point or strategic decision point, understanding what are the space of possibilities. And that has nothing to do with the gym. Obviously, that has nothing to do with discipline so much. It has something to do with creativity and understanding the adjacent possible space.
Say more about creativity. I know you to be someone who has both studied economics and finance, but also you've studied theater and thinking of the world as a stage. How do you know whether your creativity is drawing you in the next right direction in the actions that you're taking?
Well, that's largely a matter of intuition, which is very hard to listen to if you're being ruled by logical or rational frameworks. So any logical or rational rule is very good within a certain construction of the world. If you're doing something truly creative, you're changing the construction of the world, and therefore many of those rules probably do not apply. If you think about someone like King Cole Gillette, and you think about what his life was like and what a razor meant, a straight razor passed from father to son that you had to sharpen, that was heavy, that meant a lot. His conception of razor, and what are the businesses that could be around a razor? Well, okay, you could have a sharpener, or you could have shaving cream. These are the things. And if there was a management consultant back in those days before the disposables business model became a thing, it would be very reasonable for him to tell Gillette you should think about creating a branding around a shaving gel or something like that. The innovation was throwing that out, taking something that had such a history and considering it disposable. That's the innovation. That's the creativity. I'm talking about in the realm of business, but that didn't come to anybody else's mind. And if it did come to anybody else's mind, they didn't have the discipline to actually turn it into a business. And that created not just Gillette, it created the whole disposables idea. Largely printers, which came so much later, piggybacked on that innovation because they sold printers for cheap and the ink cartridges for the margin. That was the business model for a long time.
Isn't it wild that you can get on an international flight nowadays and they will literally give you earbuds? Somehow our economy has built in efficiencies in such a way where this might actually be the most efficient thing to do. And yet you might have people on the other side of the fence seeing this as wasteful. What are the perspective differences there, and how do you decipher through the nuance of that space?
Well, the first perspective is the economics of it. Is this the most cost-effective way? And the superstructure of that believes that the market is roughly efficient, which means that the resources that go into a product are costed in, and theoretically the externalities should also be costed in, which means if disposable earbuds are cheaper, then it is the best thing to do. On the other hand, there's the conservationist idea that we should minimize the amount of waste. Now, the conservationist idea doesn't have a good system for explaining, well, how much waste should we have? And if it did, then that could be costed in to the economic worldview, right? The neoclassical sort of worldview. So the capitalist system, if it worked perfectly, theoretically, which it doesn't, and I don't think it can, but it's the best economic system we have so far. At least that's the way it seems. It does what is most cost effective, right? That's generally where, given a certain amount of parameters, what's most cost effective dominates the market. Now, the cost effectiveness of it may have hidden costs that are non-economic costs. For example, like this conservation argument. Well, what about the landfills? Well, the landfills also have a price. Now, what the conservationists can say to persuade the capitalists is that, well, that cost is too low. We need to spend more money on landfill space because there is these other drawbacks that need to be remediated. And then it flows back in, and then those earbuds might not become cost effective.
Is capitalism on the downward slope? Is there something better that could come next? Or is it the best thing that we will be left with in regards to creating market efficiencies?
I don't know. I don't think anybody can credibly answer that question. Capitalism is just a big, loud word. It's a label on top of a very complex social system. And that complex social system changes. You can think about vulture capitalism versus crony capitalism versus pure capitalism, a bunch of different labels that are explaining particular social situations. People respond to the situation as it is, not an ideological label. So you can call two different countries both capitalist systems, but functionally they couldn't be more different. And so it's not so much about the label, it's about the society that is interacting in a way and having economic relations. Now, free market capitalism has and the idea of the invisible hand, and everybody's working towards their self-interest, creating optimal outcomes. That has a certain faith, and that did create massive economic growth for a while. But that was a phenomenon in a given society at a given time. As society changes, as the composition of society changes, the economic relationships change, and also the perception of value changes. This is one of the reasons why Karl Marx was so deadly wrong, is he believed that capitalism would create such productive capability, such productive capacity, that everybody could have everything without any requirements for limitation, because the engine of capitalism would achieve such productivity that there need not be scarcity. This was completely wrong. This was completely wrong because the perception of value shifted. It shifted from mass market commodities to personalized commodities. I don't want the same pair of jeans as everybody else would wear. Yes, maybe we could produce the same pair of jeans that every man, woman, and child in America could wear the same pair of jeans, and moreover, they could have as many of them as they want. But that's not what we want. We still we want something different. And largely that's a function of how we are, not just technological progress.
And that model doesn't work anyways. I mean, I'm always enamored whenever I see one of these like memes that will come across social media where it's a bunch of pictures of the different sedans from Ford and Chevy and Volkswagen, and they all look the same and they're all the same color. Or I saw a different one just a couple weeks ago that was like all of the different chicken sandwiches from McDonald's to Chick-fil-A to Arby's to whatever. And it's like the caption is something like, so this is what capitalism has to offer, all of this variety. And to your point in regards to maybe we could manufacture the same one pair of pants and give these to everybody in the world, and that would work. But that's not actually what we've seen as this sort of like Marxist socialist ideology has found its way into economies in the past. No, we've seen governments nationalize one chicken sandwich, and instead of having 20 variants of $5 tasty chicken sandwich from a number of different providers, we have one mediocre $30 chicken sandwich. Or instead of having a dozen different $35,000 sedans that the average American or whoever else could afford, we have one nationalized $150,000 Ford Model T, right? As someone who came from like post-Soviet Union society, talk about why that doesn't flesh out in practice. Why can't we just take the efficiencies that the market has created and nationalize them to have everybody have the one $5 pair of pants that they want? It becomes a $50 pair of pants. That's mediocre.
Well, first off, nobody wants the $5 pair of pants. There was a whole black market in the Soviet Union for foreign jeans, which they would pay a month's worth of salary to get and be very proud of wearing. From my parents' stories, there would be lines to get any sort of delicacy, and there would be rampant corruption because it was all tied to the government. It was all tied to the socialism doesn't work. I mean, that seems to be pretty clear. It seems to be it creates, economically speaking, it creates inferior results, and it creates massive inefficiencies. And overall, pretty much in every way, it's deficient, as far as I can tell. Why can't we take the benefits of capitalism and then just nationalize it? Well, because people generally work best when they're self-interested, when there is a component of their own interest where they capture some of the value that they create. Otherwise, there's the free rider problem. Otherwise, there's shirking, and just disinterest. Why bother? Now, creating incentives, there are non-economic incentives. There are people who work very hard with no chance of making more money because they believe in a cause, a purpose. And early socialism in Russia in the Soviet Union was very good at that. There were true believers. And any serious ideology can create true believers that are completely motivated to build, to create. But if what they're building or creating doesn't maintain that vision and doesn't inspire that confidence over time, then what they build or created will degenerate.
You mentioned towards the beginning of our conversation that you work to surround yourself with people you trust and who are direct and who are people of integrity. I know you to be someone who values willingness to articulate perspective on truth, or I think this is better, or I think this about this, or I think you should change this about what you're doing. On the flip side of that, if you haven't built a rapport with someone over a long enough period of time to know that they like to be spoken to directly and to have their shortcomings highlighted so that two peers can point those things out in each other and grow, how do you gauge how honest to be with an acquaintance or a peer in your broader social circle whenever they ask you for feedback on something? They say, what do you think of this presentation? Or what do you think of this project?
It depends how much I care about them. I'm only going to take as much risk as I have incentive to do so, in the sense that I can be very polite and tactful. Well, it's not very easy for me, but I try to be very polite and tactful, especially if I don't know a person or if I don't care too much. The more I care about a person, the more I'm going to try to tell them the truth. Because the goal of saying the truth is not for me to be liked, It's to help the person I'm talking to. As in, I'm telling you how I see it. And if I'm telling you how I see it, maybe I'm wrong and maybe I'm stupid, but I'm telling you what I think is true. It's up to you to work with that information to either discard it or to integrate it or to help it modify your probability space, whatever it is. But I'm giving you true feedback, and I'm taking a risk when I'm doing that because you might not like what I have to say. And I have to believe that either the upside to you is worth it or our relationship is strong enough such that that creates benefit or value long term. If I don't know you very well and I tell you the same thing, A, you could get offended and you could just not like me. B, you could think that I'm jockeying for position or trying to diminish you or diminish your project or get some kind of, I'm doing it out of self-interest or benefit for myself. And I'm not actually being honest, but I'm signaling in a way that could be detrimental to you or in a way to position myself, which doesn't help the relationship progress anywhere and doesn't create trust. So in order to become progressively more honest, there needs to be a larger and larger base of trust. Because if I'm telling you the truth, you have to believe me that I'm actually trying to tell you the truth. Otherwise, it falls on deaf ears and it can only create harm.
I have to know you to be a person of integrity.
Yes.
Yeah.
When I was in theater school, I was there for a certificate program and I was in the directorial program, but there were people in the acting program. And there were some which were completely talentless. They were hopeless. They were never going to make it in any capacity. As in, they were bad actors. They loved acting, but they were bad. And this is apparent, and it's, at least from the outside, it seems it's something that cannot be fixed. It's just, it's not a good use of their time. It may be it may be entertainment, but it's not a career. However, since they were there in that program, some of them, they had clearly intentions of it being a career. Imagine somebody who's 5'1" trying to make it in the NBA. I mean, we have like one person ever who's done that at that height, Muggsy Bogues. But no, don't try to get into the NBA if you're 5'1". These were the equivalent of 5'1" actors trying to make it to the NBA. And I went for a walk with one of the actors, one of the good ones, and I said, "Look, you've seen, this person or this person." He says, "Yes." I said, "They're hopeless." He says, "Absolutely." He says, and I tell him, if I told them, as lovingly and as kindly as I could, that they need to do something else, that they're never going to make this a career, it's never going to work, and they're honestly bad. They're bad at what they're doing, and there's no hope of them being good. Would they listen? Would that change anything? He said, "Oh, absolutely not. All that'll do is make them hate you and put you on the list of the haters who didn't believe in me when I make it big."
The line from Christopher Nolan's Batman Begins is coming to mind, where people need dramatic examples to shake them out of apathy. Do you think this to be true, or do you think this to be not a complete picture, or false?
I think it's generally true. I think most of the time it takes, I think for personal change to happen in a dramatic way, either there's some kind of change, some kind of event that triggers that change, or there's a continuous process that creates more and more misery to the point where it's no longer tenable to continue. So it's either an accumulation that reaches a breaking point, or it's a dramatic event. And that creates personal change, and it also creates societal change.
Whenever it's the type of event that creates societal change, Do you think that those types of events should be intentionally cultivated, or is that something that's spontaneous? It's a product of the environment reacting against itself.
I think that there are provocations to create such triggers. I think there's clearly intentional escalation of triggers once they've happened. But I think triggers generally occur when the environment is ready for it. So in a drought is when the forest fire happens, the really big one. Doesn't happen in a rainforest. There's an interaction between the state of the environment, the social environment in this case, and the trigger that happens, perhaps stochastically, but perhaps inevitably, for change to happen.
Who do you think the most important person alive right now is?
Elon Musk.
Why?
He's inspiring a positive vision of the future for most Americans.
Why do you think some people rally against him?
I think there are a great deal of people who are infected with a philosophy that hates the West, that hates life, that privileges non-human life over human life, that believes in a nihilistic and dark view of the future. There's a famous antinatalist philosopher who I'm not even going to mention, whose basic argument is that life contains more pain than pleasure, and therefore life is a net negative. To which I would say, go kill yourself. Fine. If you believe that, go kill yourself. Remove yourself from the environment if you believe it. Even if it's true, pain and pleasure are not the only things. Even if life is filled with pain, that doesn't mean it's not meaningful, and that doesn't mean that life is not good.
What is the reward or the fitness function or the return on investment for someone who's adhering to this Mephistophelian philosophy of life being net negative? Like the person who strikes out against people who they don't know, who are trying things and creating value at scale in the world. What's going on there?
Oh, I think they're losers. I think they're filled with resentment because they are not able to do anything with their own lives that's in any way productive. And therefore, they want to desecrate and denigrate anybody who is doing something productive or who is adding value. And the most grandiose way of desecration is refusing to see value at all, saying nothing is valuable at all. So let it all burn.
Is there something there to redeem? Can these people change?
I hope so, if they find God or a philosophy that elevates them instead of allows them to continue along their miserable path.
How important is a belief in a God or any religious framework for being functional and steady in your lived experience? Can we, without belief or faith in something like a God or a religious framework, use reason alone to determine the most optimal way of functioning in a world as complex as the one that we live in? Can it be done without religion or belief in a God?
No.
Say more.
Everybody has a God. Everybody has a God, whether they know it or not. Even rationality is its own form of weak God.
Is science a weak God?
Science is a weak God. Yes. Science is a method. Science is a method for understanding and systematizing repeatable phenomena. That's great. It's wonderful for what it is. When people misunderstand it and turn it into their faith, I believe in science. Well, I believe in a hammer. It's ridiculous on its face. Even science, the presuppositions of science, the epistemology of science, the way we know what we know via science, that's all based on faith. Mm-hmm. Fundamentally, it's very useful faith. So statistics is a very useful faith. But statistics assumes that the future is going to be like the past. That doesn't work when you have a phase shift. And you can't recognize a phase shift unless you're outside of the statistics, unless you're looking at the system as a whole. So anything that looks like when science becomes a faith, it's just a weak faith, and it's quite a stupid one. In terms of the bigger picture, in terms of life, everybody has a God because everybody is looking towards something, is moving towards something. And one of the ways that you could think about God, if you don't want to think about it in the religious sense, is greatest overall direction. What's the direction that you're moving to? What is pushing your art forward? Are you trying to create something more and more beautiful? Well, what is the ultimate beauty? What is that transcendental good? You sum up all of those transcendental goods, and that is the greatest overall direction. God. Or you could think of God as here's something that's I believe is true. So I think that God is real. Not that it's important if he is an entity external to me. God is real in the pragmatic sense. So pragmatic truth is a truth that helps you do something. So you have a goal. You're trying to get from point A to point B. Whatever helps you get to point B is true within the context of that goal. The square root of -1 does not exist. It doesn't exist. It's I, mathematics, I equals square root of -1. Without it, we can't do a lot of math. The concept of I unlocks a great deal of capability. Therefore, at least within the context of mathematics, I is pragmatically true. Square root of -1, I is true. Interestingly, math also wonderfully maps onto physics. Physics, our reality, not a model of our reality, often is described by math. And I has a role in that. Very interesting. So things that don't exist are pragmatically true. So whether or not God exists as an external entity, the belief in God definitely helps you. Definitely helps you get through life. Definitely, even just as an idea, assists, helps, directs you along a path. And if you're looking at it observationally, generally helps people be happier, healthier, more productive.
Is it possible to know the system as a whole, or is it a fool's errand?
Depends which system.
For a long time, our conceptual framework around science was as you described. We can map math to what's going on in the world, and we're going to predicate our assumptions about what might happen next on the basis of certainty. We know that if this is happening, or we observe this to be happening in the world now, then we can model these effects forward, and we'll see this a year from now or 10 years from now, and so on and so forth. And around 100 years ago, this framework was shattered. Our predication on certainty was steered towards one of probability during the quantum revolution, right? We're like, oh, okay, it's just nonsense and statistics down here. And you said something interesting, which is the idea that if we base our predications of reality on the idea of probability, we will be blind to phase shifts. And in order to see a phase shift coming, we have to be able to see the system as a whole. And so what I'm asking in regards to the ability to see the system as a whole is, can we parameterize that system at all to identify what does post-probability science look like? Or what does it mean to know something that's that complex? Or that's where I'm saying, or is that a fool's errand and we have to have something like faith instead?
I think when there is a real phase shift or regime shift in a system, that is its own parameter that you need to recognize and add. Once it's happened, you can conceptualize it. But in order to recognize that it happened, you have to keep your eyes open. You have to actually be observing the system and not being dogmatic about the parameters that you're already calculating. So Eric Weinstein recently brought up this example, which I really liked. Said, all right, so most of the days of the year, regardless of how cold it is, you can jump into the lake. But one day it goes below zero, the lake freezes. If you jump into the lake, you can't. You'll break your head. It's ice. It's no longer water. Now, if you've never seen ice, or if you don't know that water freezes, you can build up very strong statistics about how you can always jump into the water, because out of the last 180 days, you've jumped into the water, whether it was plus 10 or plus 50, and everything was fine. But recognizing the phase shift and seeing ice versus water, that's not in the way that you wrote down that system. So in a way, that's faith. In a way, that's faith that there could be something that you don't know. That's the faith that keeps your eyes open.
The faith that keeps your eyes open is the faith that there could be something that you don't know. That seems so obvious in hindsight. Because if you ask anybody in the entire world, is there something that you don't know? However many people would say, yes, there is. And yet everybody seems to be ignoring this axiom of there's stuff going on that you don't understand. And it's okay to not understand what's going on. And then there's all of these people trying to fill the void by being like, but we can explain it. Mm-hmm. How should an individual operate in an environment like this?
Understand your own motivations and understand the motivations of others. Most people who jump to truths, who are seeking certainty, cannot contend with the discomfort of not knowing, of there not being an explanation, of there being randomness, of there being an incompleteness in the world. That's one of the big allures of a complete and coherent ideology. A complete and coherent ideology explains everything, and it blocks you from seeing anything that is outside of it, because you start living and breathing and seeing everything within the constructs of such an ideology. And then you have this fake bliss that you have it all figured out. Most people really, really want to feel that bliss. They want to feel, oh, I have it all figured out. Or at least somebody has it all figured out. There's this guru, he has it all figured out. Or there's this theory, he has it all figured out. The scientists have it figured out. Or the politicians, they have it figured out. Oh, the rich people, they have it figured out. The businessmen, they have it figured out. They want to believe that the world makes sense. They want to believe that the world has some justice. And those deep desires, they lead them to find simple certainties. That is manipulated by people who can choose to feed them these certainties.
What is the thing in your life that you are most certain of? Or something that you have substantial amount of faith in, other than God?
That life is good, life is worth preserving, and that family matters.
That family matters. Say more about that.
I believe that you have a responsibility to your family, and then to your friends, and then to your community, and then to your nation. I think that there's a concentric circles of relationships and obligations and responsibilities. And they largely tie to your emotional connection with those people or those groups of people. And that connection is central and completely core to the functioning of society and to the functioning of a healthy psyche. I think as soon as you become a universalist, as soon as you think, okay, I love everybody as much as I love my brother, or I love everybody as much as I love my son, or I love everybody as much as I love my father. You're unless it's a platitude, unless you don't really mean it, unless it's social signaling or virtue signaling, if it's not true, then you could probably get away with it. But if you actually believe that, or if you live that way, it's horribly destructive for your psyche. And if there are too many people who live that way, then it destroys society completely. Social bonds are everything. We are a tribal species. We can create tribes that are bigger than any physical tribe that can exist. But tribalism, the separation of the separation and elevation of a group of people in your care is necessary to the functioning of any healthy society. And it's even necessary as an analogy, as a metaphor. A cell cannot exist without a cell membrane. You cannot have a body without a skin. There is a separation between the inside and the outside. And the rejection of a separation of the inside and the outside can only lead to destruction, chaos, and death.
You cannot have an agent without a sense of self. Firm sense of self. What do you do to lift up the people who are in your tribe?
Add as much value as I can. I try to help the people I care about. That's all. If I care about somebody, I want them to be the best that they can be.
Iosif, before we have to wrap up, I want to ask you, who are you, where do you come from, and where are you going?
Well, I'm Iosif Gershteyn. Was born in the Soviet Union in 1987. Moved here to the States in 1990. Grew up here. Right now I'm living in Boston, working on a biotech company that focuses in on cancer and hopefully treating cancer as we move forward to clinic. And where am I going? I'm going to try to create beauty and try to minimize suffering.
Godspeed thee on your mission. It's been a pleasure talking to you today.
You too. Thank you, Ben.